My father-in-law, Gerald, picked his 65th birthday party to pull the rug out from under all of us. There he was, glass raised, as if he was about to give a classic toast. Instead, he dropped a bomb. He told the whole room he wanted my 6-year-old son to take a DNA test right then and there. Everyone, relatives, business friends, just froze. He said he just deserved to know who his real family actually was. It wasn't even about me, not really. It wasn't about my son. It was about Gerald proving a point and humiliating me in front of people who mattered to him. Let me just put you in that moment with me for a second, because nothing that happened next, none of it, would have happened if Gerald hadn't chosen to show off his suspicion in front of an audience. I'm Danielle Hartwell. I used to be Danielle Reyes. That matters, I promise. I'm 36. I've been married to Marcus for 8 years. If you think Gerald's announcement came out of nowhere, you're wrong. He'd been working his way up to it for almost a decade, usually with subtle jabs and tiny, deniable insults. I learned to just brace myself every time I had to see him, because constant arguing with your husband's father isn't living, it's just exhausting. Gerald built his construction business from nothing. That much is true. Over 30 years, he turned Hartwell Engineering and Construction into a regional giant. The kind of company whose name you'd see on cranes and billboards all over our part of the state. The success gave him this bedrock belief that he was right about everything: work, family, life, you name it. People who build something that big from scratch often end up believing the same instincts that made them rich apply to literally every other area of their life too: parenting, marriage, who's good enough to marry into the family. Gerald was exactly that kind of man, and 30 years of people telling him he was brilliant for his business decisions had apparently convinced him he was equally brilliant at reading people. I met him about 6 months into dating Marcus at some steakhouse downtown that Gerald clearly chose because it was the kind of place where the staff knew his name. And honestly, it took maybe 20 minutes to figure out he had me pegged as not one of us. My parents weren't rich. Dad fixed things for the city: water mains, sewer lines, the unglamorous infrastructure work nobody thinks about until it breaks. Mom cleaned houses for most of my childhood, including for a couple of years when I was in middle school, a house 2 streets over from where Gerald's own neighborhood started. A detail I never once mentioned to him, partly out of pride and partly because I knew exactly how he'd use it. Gerald never said any of this straight, but he didn't have to. He'd slip these little remarks into conversation, a glance, a comment about starting from scratch, that made it clear he saw me as a permanent stain on the Hartwell name, just because I hadn't started on third base the way he assumed people in his world were supposed to. I want to be fair, because that matters. Marcus never treated me like that, not for one single day of the 8 years we've been together. He stood up to his dad, married me with zero hesitation, and built a life with me. Gerald's hovering disapproval be damned. Gerald came to our wedding, sure, but he looked like he was taking part in some elaborate hostage exchange, smiling for photos and saying all the right things to the other guests, while making it clear, in 100 tiny ways only I seemed to notice, that he considered the whole event a kind of necessary inconvenience rather than something to actually celebrate. He never warmed up. If anything, after we had our son, Caleb, his tactics just got meaner, more specific, harder to laugh off, the way I'd learned to laugh off the early stuff. There's one Sunday dinner I always remember. Caleb was barely 2. Family crowded around the table, the smell of his mother's pot roast filling the whole dining room, and Gerald looked at Caleb and said, "He doesn't look much like Marcus, does he?" Like he was commenting on the weather. He was careful though, so if you called him out, he could play innocent, like he didn't mean anything by it, just an idle observation a grandfather might make at any family dinner. Marcus brushed it off. I pretended to laugh. What else do you do at the dinner table when someone throws in a live grenade disguised as small talk, surrounded by relatives who'd absolutely take his side if you made a scene over what looked, on the surface, like nothing at all? He didn't stop there. For 4 years, Gerald found ways to repackage the same accusations, spacing them out just enough that no single comment ever felt like a pattern unless you were the one keeping score, which I was. Quietly the whole time. Caleb's 4th birthday, surrounded by other parents from his preschool class, Gerald. So funny how some kids just don't take after either parent. Christmas dinner the next year, in front of his own wife no less, Gerald. Marcus, have you ever looked at your baby pictures? I don't think Caleb looks like anyone in our family. Always just light enough on the surface, always just clear enough to sting, always delivered with that same easy, deniable smile that made pushing back feel like overreacting to nothing. So why didn't I stop him? Why didn't I push back harder? I've asked myself that 100 times, lying awake some nights, running through every version of the confrontation I never had. And the answer is, what would that have solved? Gerald just acted more wounded, played the misunderstood patriarch being unfairly attacked by an ungrateful daughter-in-law, and honestly, I was tired. I never cheated, I never hid anything, so facing off against his suspicions again and again drained the life out of me in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived it. Every denial somehow made me look more guilty, the way denying something always seems to in other people's eyes regardless of how true it is. I was stuck, defending a fact that should never have needed defending. Over and over, to a man who'd already decided what he wanted to believe long before I ever opened my mouth. There's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from defending something true, repeatedly, to someone who's already decided he doesn't believe you regardless of what you say. It's not like fighting about something real, where the conversation eventually moves somewhere, resolves something, lands on common ground, even if it's uncomfortable getting there. This was just the same scene replaying itself, year after year, with Gerald cast as the wounded truth-teller, and me always somehow ending up as the one who looked defensive, no matter how calmly I responded to him. Marcus tried. He really did. They had heated fights. Sometimes Marcus came home tense and quiet, trying not to show me how rattled he was. I'd ask him what happened, and he'd just shake his head and say it was nothing, the same way I'd learned to brush off Gerald's comments myself. Both of us quietly protecting each other from the full weight of how bad it actually was behind closed doors, like we were each trying to absorb our half of it alone so the other person wouldn't have to carry the whole thing. But Gerald always found a way to say what he wanted, in a setting where standing up to him would just make us look unreasonable. He waited for family events, holidays, the kind of public setting where calling him out risked making you the one who seemed to be overreacting. He wanted an audience, every single time, because an audience was the whole entire point of doing it that way, instead of just saying it to my face in private, where I could actually answer him without 30 relatives watching. By the time Caleb turned 6, I had this emotional shield I put up anytime Gerald was around, calm, polite, detached, the kind of armor you build specifically for one person and one person only. It wasn't free. I lived with this quiet anger all the time, simmering somewhere under the surface of every family gathering, a low hum I'd gotten so used to, I almost stopped noticing it was there most days. But I wouldn't give him the fight he wanted. It just wasn't worth it, not when the cost of losing my composure in front of his crowd would always outweigh whatever small satisfaction I might get from finally saying what I actually thought of him. So there we were. Gerald's birthday party was a big deal, a fancy venue downtown, the kind with white tablecloths and a string quartet playing softly near the entrance. Family, business partners, even a couple of local politicians he'd cultivated relationships with over the years, for reasons that were never entirely clear to me but were obviously useful to him. He wasn't just celebrating. He was putting on a show, the kind of event where every detail, the venue, the guest list, the catering, was really just a vehicle for reinforcing exactly how important Gerald Hartwell had become over the decades since he started that company, with nothing but a truck and a line of credit. A story he loved telling at every single one of these events like it was the first time anyone had heard it. Marcus and I brought Caleb, who was thrilled to put on his little button-up shirt and eat cake with his cousins, completely unaware that he was about to become the centerpiece of the worst moment of the entire evening. The kind of thing that even now, I'm grateful he was too young to fully understand or remember clearly. Early in the night, I watched Gerald. He'd had maybe 1 or 2 extra drinks and was moving around the room like the mayor of his own private town, working tables the way he probably worked clients, a handshake here, a loud laugh there, his arm around somebody's shoulder for the photo. Most people saw cheerful party energy. I knew better. He was gearing himself up. I felt a pit open in my stomach but couldn't put my finger on why. Not yet. I caught Marcus's eye across the room at one point, and even he seemed to sense it, some shift in his father's energy that neither of us could name precisely, but both of us clocked anyway, the particular instinct you develop after years of bracing for someone's bad moments without ever quite knowing what shape the bad moment is going to take. I almost said something to Marcus right then, suggested we leave early. Find some excuse about Caleb being tired, the bedtime routine, anything. I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Gerald was just enjoying his own party a little too enthusiastically, the way anyone might at their own 65th birthday, surrounded by people telling them how successful they'd been their whole life. I wish, looking back, I'd trusted that instinct sooner. It wouldn't have changed what eventually happened, not really, since Gerald clearly had this planned out in his own head for longer than just that one evening. But I think about that moment sometimes anyway, the last few minutes before everything actually shifted, when I still had the option, however small, of simply not being in the room for what came next. The whole thing unraveled right after the cake. Gerald's business partner was giving the standard speech. Warm, practiced, the kind designed to let everyone know the real party was about to begin. Full of inside jokes about decades of partnership that most of the room only half followed. As soon as he finished, Gerald picked up his glass and stood. I figured, just like everyone else, that he'd say thank you, offer a toast, maybe embarrass his wife with a bad joke. The usual. But that's not what happened. Gerald turned, facing our table, staring straight at Caleb, who was busy tackling his second slice of cake, totally innocent about what was coming, frosting on his chin, completely unaware that an entire room had just gone quiet around him. "You know," Gerald said, and his voice cut right through the room. You could feel everyone pause, even people across the hall who didn't know him that well, conversations dying mid-sentence the way they do when something unexpected starts happening. "I think it's time this family figured out who really belongs." He was looking at Caleb. "I want a DNA test on that boy. I deserve to know I'm his grandfather. I think we all do." Let me try to explain what that felt like. This wasn't some dramatic explosion. It was worse. A slow, suffocating, I knew this day was coming feeling, the kind you spend years trying to brace for, but when it arrives, you're somehow still not ready, no matter how many times you've imagined the scene playing out in your head. I've always known Gerald didn't fully trust me. He'd made little remarks for years about how Caleb takes after my side, surely, and, family resemblance can be so tricky. All of it with a sideways smile to other people in the room. The kind of smile that invites everyone else to be in on the joke at my expense without ever quite saying what the joke actually was. So everyone's staring. Relatives, business friends, even those couple of city council members who'd shown up mostly for the open bar. Marcus, beside me, went stiff. He found my hand under the table and squeezed it so hard I almost told him to ease up, except I was holding on just as tightly, both of us gripping each other like we were the only solid thing left in that room. Caleb wasn't totally following, but he could feel the mood shift, the way kids always do, looking up from his cake with a confused, uncertain little frown that broke my heart faster than anything Gerald himself had actually said out loud. I didn't lose it. I didn't get flustered. Years of practice, specifically for Gerald, kicked in, every bit of that calm I'd been quietly building for 6 years, arriving exactly when I needed it most. I looked straight at him and spoke just as loud and clear as he had. Absolutely, Gerald. I have nothing to hide. If you want proof, you can have it right here, right now, in front of everyone. We can clear this up definitively, since you want it public. He expected me to act guilty, I think, or nervous or hurt, something he could point to afterward as evidence he'd been right to suspect me all along. He looked almost thrown off by how flatly I agreed. And then, because I'd been quiet for years, but I'm not stupid, I added, but let's be thorough. It's not just my son, is it? Let's test everyone in this family whose role has always been assumed. Including you, Gerald. Including Marcus. Let's check that Marcus is your biological son, just to be sure. Fair's fair. I didn't say it with a sneer. I kept it light, the way Gerald always did when dropping his little doubts about Caleb's paternity, mirroring his own tone back at him almost exactly. But you could feel the needle land. He laughed, a little too hard, the kind of laugh that's working overtime to cover something underneath it. Fine, he said, waving one hand, trying to make it all sound trivial, almost bored. Test whoever you want. We've got nothing to hide. Now the room really couldn't look away. I could feel the entire space holding its breath, waiting to see which one of us would blink first. And for the first time in 8 years of his quiet, deniable cruelty, I genuinely felt like I held the steadier hand at that table. We got it done over the next 2 weeks. Marcus set everything up with a discreet clinic, no big production this time, just quiet swabs, no onlookers, nothing for anyone to gossip about at the next dinner party. Results sent to Marcus and Gerald, like Gerald himself insisted, thorough and above board, exactly the way he'd loudly demanded it should be done in front of his own birthday crowd. Caleb's results came first. Zero surprise. Marcus is 100% Caleb's father. It was the result I'd always known was coming, and it put Gerald in the uncomfortable position of having to pretend satisfaction when you could tell he had somewhere else. He wanted to aim his suspicion, some part of him still searching, even with the proof sitting right in front of him, for an angle that would let him save face after everything he'd said at that party. The second result, the formality, took a little longer to come back. I figured it was just theater, a way to make a point and watch him squirm a little for once. But when Marcus called, a call from his childhood house, his voice low and sounding utterly lost in a way I genuinely never heard from him before, I went cold straight through. Marcus wasn't Gerald's biological son. From there, everything sped up fast. Gerald refused to believe it at first, demanded a second test from an entirely different lab, paid extra to expedite it. Practically begged the technician on the phone, Marcus told me later, for some kind of explanation that would make the first result go away. Same answer came back, no mistake, no lab error, nothing to dispute. The error, whatever it was, had nothing to do with us, nothing to do with anything happening now. It happened 38 years ago, in a hospital room none of us had ever set foot in. We started digging through old hospital records, Marcus and I, searching for anything that could explain what happened, spending entire weekends on the phone with records departments and old archived microfiche nobody had looked at in decades. It took weeks, working with a lawyer who specialized in exactly this kind of historical hospital dispute, the kind of niche legal specialty I didn't even know existed until we needed it. Eventually, we dug up records from the small-town hospital where Marcus was born, a facility long since absorbed into a bigger system. There was an incident flagged in the old system, 2 baby boys, born close together on the same chaotic night, briefly mixed up in the nursery before being sorted back, the hospital believed at the time, correctly. The hospital thought they'd fixed it quietly, records closed, nothing sent to either affected family. This was decades back, before modern checks and double bands, the kind of mistake that genuinely happened more often than anyone likes to admit from that era of hospital record keeping. back when a nursery full of newborns relied on handwritten tags and a nurse's memory more than anything resembling today's systems. So out there somewhere was Gerald's actual biological son, raised by a completely different family for almost 40 years, with no idea any of this had ever happened. And Gerald had spent decades raising a boy, Marcus, who only now discovered he wasn't his father's biological child at all. Those few weeks were unnerving at home, in a way I genuinely didn't expect. You might think I was smug about it, or that the entire mess felt like justice, like Gerald finally was getting exactly what he deserved after years of putting me through the ringer. But living through it was just confusing and sad, mostly, more than anything else. Marcus was lost in it, suddenly questioning all the things he'd never once questioned about himself in 38 years of simply existing as who he thought he was. Day after day, he sat staring at old family photos, seeing his own reflection and not knowing whose eyes were looking back anymore. I'd find him at 3 a.m. sometimes, sitting at the kitchen table with the same shoebox of childhood pictures spread out in front of him, tracing his own face in photos like he was looking for a stranger hiding in plain sight, somebody he'd lived inside his whole life without ever once meeting properly. I tried to be there for him in whatever way actually helped, which mostly just meant sitting beside him at that table some nights, not filling the silence with reassurances he wasn't ready to hear yet, not rushing him towards some tidy emotional resolution just because I wanted to see him feel better faster. There's no real script for what to say to your husband when he's just found out. The entire genetic foundation of his identity was never what he thought it was, and I learned, slowly, over those weeks, that most nights, what he actually needed wasn't an answer at all. Just company while he sat with a question that didn't have one yet, and might not for a long while. Once the hospital finally linked the records properly, they tracked down the other boy, a man named Thomas, also 38 now, living 2 states away, married, with teenage kids of his own. When he heard the news, relayed carefully through the hospital's legal department and then, eventually, directly from Gerald himself, he didn't want a soap opera reunion, only a single, awkward call with Gerald first, and eventually, months later, one brief, careful in-person meeting. Thomas was polite, but firm about where he stood. He already had a dad, the man who'd actually raised him, and he wasn't interested in rewriting his whole life or his understanding of his own family just because of newly revealed biology that arrived decades too late to mean very much in any practical sense. I respected that about him more than I expected to, hearing it secondhand from Marcus after that first call. He didn't owe any of us an emotional performance. Just because our families happened to intersect through a 40-year-old hospital mistake nobody involved had ever asked for or had any way of knowing about at the time. Gerald, for once in his entire life, didn't have a comeback ready. Over the following months, I watched him come apart in ways I genuinely never thought him capable of. This man who'd spent 30 years being right about everything, who'd built an entire personality around unshakable confidence in his own judgment. He'd built his identity around bloodline and legacy, all these things he thought were simple, settled facts, and it turned out none of it had ever been true the way he assumed. And it all happened because he tried to embarrass me, to put me in my place in front of a room full of people over something he had no real proof of in the first place. Just a feeling he'd nursed for years, and finally decided to weaponize publicly. Maybe 2 months after the party, Gerald came over, just him, no announcement beforehand, just his car pulling into our driveway on an ordinary Tuesday evening. He sat at our kitchen table, same spot where Marcus had spent so many nights just holding old photos, and apologized. The words tumbled out, awkward and raw, nothing like the smooth, controlled Gerald who commanded that entire birthday party with a single sentence months earlier. He didn't talk about Caleb's DNA test, which had never actually been the real issue anyway, not once it came back exactly the way I had always known it would. Instead, Gerald apologized for what he'd done to my reputation, for attacking me publicly because he never bothered to actually think through what his accusations would mean. Not for me, not for Caleb, not for anyone in that room who'd have to remember that moment for years afterward, every time they saw any of us at a family gathering. I forgave him, but not as a grand gesture, just a small, careful start, the kind of forgiveness that leaves room to still be cautious going forward. His words didn't erase years of subtle digs or change how complicated family dinners still felt sitting across from him afterward. But it was the first time Gerald owned up to being flat out wrong about me. The first time in 8 years he'd said it plainly instead of letting it sit there, deniable, the way he always had before, always leaving himself an exit if I'd ever tried to call him out on it directly. Marcus and Gerald now have a relationship that's kind of hesitant, a little more honest. Nothing like it was before, but not broken either. The two of them slowly figuring out, in fits and starts, what their relationship even is now. That the thing they'd never once had to question about it turned out not to be true. They keep showing up for each other anyway, figuring out what father-son actually means when it has nothing to do with biology and never really did, not in any way that mattered day to day. Marcus told me one night, much later, sitting out on our back porch after Caleb had gone to bed, that nothing about this changed who Gerald was to him. The man who raised him, who showed up every day, who taught him to ride a bike and sat through every terrible school play, whether they shared DNA or not. I told him Caleb would always know that too, that the lesson sitting underneath all of it, if there even was one single lesson to take from any of this, was that the people who actually show up are the ones who get to call themselves family, regardless of what any test happens to say about the blood underneath it. We still see Gerald. Family dinners have changed, quieter now, more careful, but also somehow more honest than they used to be when everything ran smooth on the surface and rotten just underneath it. There's zero whispered jokes about resemblance anymore. Gerald never once brought up Caleb not looking like Marcus again, not after everything. I don't think he ever will. He learned in the hardest, most public way possible exactly what it costs to go looking for a truth you're not actually prepared to find, and exactly whose life ends up paying for it once you finally do. Sometimes in ways you could never have predicted, sitting there at your own birthday party with a glass raised, certain you already knew exactly how the evening was going to end.